Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto repeats the entire Chunin exams over and over again? Until he saves Konoha. Part 2. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and my second channel link in description. Please check and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Pissed. Hinata-chan, are you awake? Eep. The lavender-haired girl came awake in fright, only to see Naruto there with the goggles she'd once given him on his head where his headband used to be. His ninja marker now hung around his neck, like hers did. Before she could conclude anything, he was leaning closer. I'll leave so you can get dressed. I'd just hoped we could walk to the exam together. After all, I just discovered the cutest girl in our class was also the one who has been giving me presents all these years. Thank you, Hinata-chan. He bent close to place a kiss on her unresisting forehead. You believed in me. That, more than anything, is what kept me going. Then he was gone. She hurried to wash herself and scramble into her clothes. Naruto was waiting for her by the gate. So high she was that her long-time crush had finally discovered, and liked her, that her feet barely hit the ground as they chatted along on their way to the center. She was walking on clouds the entire time. It never occurred to her to wonder how he knew the guard schedule and sentry posts around the Hyuga complex well enough to sneak into her room, or that they couldn't have their bloodline active all of the time due to chakra constraints. For Naruto, it was the least he could do after finding out about her unhappy home life. Really, he'd always thought having no parents was bad, but having her dad was possibly worse. The guy was an active negative. He'd been upset before the time loop when Neji told him about the caged bird seal, but between that, plus what he'd been worming out of Kurenai and the Hokage, plus what he could get by prompting Hinata, sometimes confronting Neji, also, he was beginning to get an extremely poor opinion of the clan, or at least of the clan head. It had taken weeks of learning her responses, learning how to befriend her quickly and get her to trust him, but in a conversation about how to help Hinata, Kurenai, whom he'd gotten half drunk, had told him of that time she'd picked up the shy girl to take her to the academy for her first class, how she'd warned the father that being a genin was a dangerous path for Hinata. Naruto still felt chilled over her quote of the man's response, that it didn't matter, as Hinata was a failure and the Hyuga clan had no use for her. Then the coldness of Hiashi declaring, if she dies, she dies. Worst of all, he'd said that in front of her with Hinata right there listening. No, in Naruto's mind, the Hyuga clan was a problem that had to be fixed. And the biggest part of that to him was making sure Hinata could be happy. Fortunately, at least that part was easy. He loved that girl, and only part of that was she was the person who'd taught him what love was. Say Kabuto, what have you got on Neji Hyuga? The silver-haired ninja selected a card from deep within. It says here he was last year's top rookie. Unarmed fighting specialist, practicing his family's gentle fist style. His bloodline also makes him a prime contender in the exams. Nothing on the caged bird seal. Naruto though despondently, and nearly turned away before pausing. What's the top card in your deck say? Oh. It's a chart showing the population of the 5 great ninja villages and how they compare to each other. See. Say Kabuto. What's the second card down in your deck say? Oh. That lists off the leaders of the various elemental countries. Here, let me show you. Say Kabuto. What's the third card in your deck say? Oh. Well here, let's see. Ah. That's my listing of the various villages that have hosted the Chunin exam, in order, ever since I started taking it. Only a memento, really. They never ask. Say Kabuto. What's the 82nd card down in your deck say? Oh. Just picking numbers are you? Well, let's see anyway. That's a nin info card on a girl who died during our last exam. I guess I should throw that one away. What did she die of? Oh. A rain ninja killed her using a rain of needles. It was ugly, but not too unexpected. She just wasn't up to taking the Chunin test, to be honest. Say Kabuto. What's the 292nd card down in your deck say? Oh, wow, I never expected to be asked anything like that. Just picking numbers out of the air, are you? Well, let's have a look. Ah, it's the bottom one, and it looks like an information chart on Hayate Gecko, a special Jonin of Konoha and frequently an instructor of the Chunin exams when they are held locally. It says here that he is in chronically poor health, which is particularly sad since his specialty is swordsmanship, although he is also a master of the shadow clone technique. Thanks, Naruto waved, then paused, turning back to face the silver-haired genin. How do you make those cards, anyway? Kabuto smiled, straightening his glasses. Oh, it's pretty simple. Here, let me show you how to make your own. Do you have a piece of paper handy? Naruto smiled. I'll bring one tomorrow. Well, no need to waste time. I think I have a spare on me. Kabuto started rummaging around in his pouch, but came up nothing. Well, I guess not. Sorry, I guess we'll do it tomorrow. It's not like I have a card I can just erase to show you. Naruto, still smiling, suggested, try cards 82, 103, and 212. Oh, hi Sakura. The blonde, orange-clad genin called out as he blurred past. Pink hair swishing in the breeze of his passage, the girl paused to wonder at Naruto's behavior before continuing on her walk towards the test center. Why hadn't Naruto bugged her? Oi, Nara, she heard him call out in the distance. You up to a shogi game after the test, if the examiners don't need us? So troublesome. You wouldn't be any challenge. Win or lose, I'll take Ino off your hands for a day. Deal. Stupid. Why would I agree to such a thing? Ino objected, fists clenched. Because I'll carry your things while you shop, and help you out in your store for the rest of the day, the other yellow-haired genin told her. Ino blinked once, twice, then smiled. Sure. Thanks Naruto. Behind them, the pink-haired girl stood, blinking over this exchange. Naruto whistled as he skipped along. He was now varying his daily schedule as much as possible. Some days he picked up Hinata at her home and spent the day with her, and those were always nice. He and Hinata had really started to become close friends as he learned more about her, and he'd really started to like her. It was hard not to like her when she already liked him so much. From her perspective, from what she told him, his just suddenly revealing that he liked her too was a gift from heaven. So he could reveal all sorts of knowledge about her likes and dislikes and she would just assume that he'd somehow miraculously been observing her while she'd stalked him. In short, she'd gladly accept whatever level of friendship he offered her. Naruto had, very quickly, grown to like and appreciate her. Nobody else in all of those repeats had been changing how they acted towards him, except her, so she stood out in that whatever attention he gave her would change her reactions toward him. It had quickly become a lifeline to the endlessly repeating boy. However, he was careful not to rely on it too much, lest the two became boring. And he didn't think he could bear to have his one, true friend start to bore him. He'd rather die. Well, he had died, fairly often actually, and it hadn't stuck, but it was the sentiment that counted. So he reserved those Hinata days for when he really needed them, once a week or so at most, and even so he'd begun to take her out on picnics and so on, varying their dates as much as possible to keep things fresh. Other days, well, some days he researched, both the Hyuga clan and other topics. The conversations to impress his friends had lost most of their initial luster. By this point, when he started to reveal hidden knowledge, they tested and tested him to find its limits, until that took all day without him learning about any new subjects he hadn't covered. He'd found he could change that when he had a new topic of his own to introduce, but those were hard to think of, as left to their own devices they'd all ask the same questions over again leading to the same subjects he'd studied before. So he'd taken to breaking into the academy and reading the school books over, including some texts he had never owned any copies of, and some of which had been sold to him as special copies, with information deleted or changed, to teach him wrong answers just to have fresh material to inject into those conversations, as otherwise they grew too boring. But he had also started to vary whom he'd hang out with on most days. Nara was a bright spot on the otherwise dull backdrop of repetition, in that after the lazy boy had taught him shogi they'd been able to play together, and their games had always been different. Of course, Naruto always lost, but that wasn't the point. Ino was another refreshing person to be around. As he'd begun to expand his circle of friends, Naruto had discovered the girl to be nothing like Sakura was and yet everything he'd hoped she would be. To put that another way, all of the qualities he'd previously admired about his pink-haired former crush had been taught to her by Ino, who also had none of Sakura's flaws. Well, none except a crush on the Uchiha anyway, but their Ino was capable of listening to reason. Sakura never was, in all of the times he'd tried her. The textbook definition of a chauvinist was, a blindly devoted patriot, and by that Sakura was definitely a Sasuke chauvinist. Nothing he did was wrong in her eyes, nor could he do anything wrong as far as she was concerned. Naruto had long since grown tired of it. But luckily, he didn't have to put up with it, as there was nothing that required him to hang around with his team outside of missions. So long as he showed up for tests, they had nothing to complain about. At least until Orochimaru killed them again. And by spending less time with his team, Naruto got to hang out with more interesting people. Ino was one such. By just suggesting one thing or another he could get her to shop for it, and so long as he stayed in disguise, for reasons he found easy to explain to her, they'd go around town shopping for whatever. Doing such, he was learning how to tell good deals from bad, judge prices and product quality, as well as where to get deals, all stuff he'd never known before, as he'd been lucky to get inside a store's door growing up. Those times they shopped for food, she'd also help show him how to cook, which was yet another of those skills he'd never had anyone to teach him as he'd been growing up. His ramen obsession was a function of three things: his desperation to eat something, his inability to shop normally, people sold him old, out-of-date or rancid food as often as possible, and all for premium prices, which was a real problem back before he could read and couldn't tell they were cheating him, and not knowing how to cook on his own, forcing him to choose the simplest of all food to prepare, even though it had all of the nutritional value of warm cardboard. It was probably only his healing ability that kept him alive. Well, that and the people at Ichiraku, who were nice to him. No, Naruto was swiftly becoming very fond of Ino, and after shopping, and sometimes a meal, she'd let him help out in her family's flower shop, usually in his sexy Naruto-chan disguise, to avoid scaring off any customers, where he learned about the various flowers, their meanings and properties. So that was good. By now Naruto had exhausted the limits of what Iruka could teach on most school subjects. The man was only a Chunin, and a schoolteacher at that, so while he had a broad grasp of the essential ninja basics on up to Chunin level, his focus had been down, on teaching genin, not up, on learning jonin level techniques or knowledge. But still, while Naruto might not be Chunin level on most skills, it was nice for him to have the book smarts of his hoped for ninja rank, and to be able to calculate a parabola when he needed to. So he went on reading books on those subjects for answers to give Hinata, because asking Iruka grew to be too much of a pain, as his former teacher took longer to find things than just looking up the answers himself. Next day he was planning on losing a bet with Kiba and paying a forfeit of having to help out around that family's kennel, where he learned almost as many things as at Ino's shop. They just weren't as nice about it, and taught about dogs instead of flowers. After that, well, maybe he'd hang out with the Hokage for a day and prompt the old man to tell him stories. That had started out as a way to learn about his former favorite student, Orochimaru, but it turned out the old guy had a storytelling bone or two in his body, and he'd lived so long and seen so much stuff, all he'd have to do is prompt him the right way, and the Hokage never seemed to run out of material, really interesting stuff, too. Yeah, it was worth it. He'd go hang out with the Hokage again after this. After who knows how long training with Ebisu, months of hard work on basic chakra control to be decent. Then weeks each spent mastering intricacies of the body switch, basic clone, and transformation techniques, then more months spent on further chakra control exercises until he was tolerable, above average, but barely. The special Jonin had taken him back to the basic essential 3 ninja techniques again until he could perform them without seals, on almost no notice and with hardly any sign he was doing them. It was hardly possible to master them any further. There was only so much you could do to refine something, and he'd about hit that limit. Yes, Ebisu liked to focus on the basics. He considered them important, vital even, or it could just be that he disliked Naruto that much. Once more the blonde genin showed up for his instruction, almost physically able to feel his expectation of the guy wanting to spend more time refining basic techniques, or to show him yet more minor refinements to establish slightly greater chakra control, on the road up to acceptable, almost good. He nearly fell down in a faint when his teacher declared it was time the boy ought to learn a jutsu that wasn't among the basic three. Finally, at last, he got to learn body flicker, the short-range transportation technique. Okay, it wasn't much, being both low rank and common, almost a calling card for being a true ninja. But hey, he was excited. Kakashi may have 1,000 ninja techniques, but Naruto only had 4 that he hadn't invented himself. One more made a big difference. Sasuke, you do sense something odd about Naruto. Having failed to get a useful response from her crush as he passed by where she sat eating, Sakura went back to her lunch, gazing off at her other teammate, who was laughing and joking with a trio of normally reserved genin from Hidden Sound. The next day it would be Hidden Rain, but she didn't know that. Naruto. A voice asked from the door to his apartment. The boy looked up from what he was doing. Oi, Sakura. I wasn't expecting you. He looked oddly puzzled by that statement, but he hid it well, so she didn't notice. Her mind was preoccupied anyway, but not so much she didn't notice the parts strewn on the floor around him. What are you doing? Oh, the boy gestured casually to the open book on the floor beside him. Learning how to fix things. The lock on my door has been busted for a long time. I thought I'd learn how to repair it. That's nice, the kunoichi mumbled, not really meaning it. So what brings you here? He prompted. Earlier today, I saw you talking with some sound ninja, she stated. I don't think that's right. They could just be using you. They might do anything to get ahead in the exam. What are you doing? Oh, the boy gestured casually to the open book on the counter beside him. Learning how to fix things. The hot water tap in my sink has been busted for a long time. I thought I'd learn how to repair it. That's nice, the kunoichi mumbled, not really meaning it. So what brings you here? He prompted. Earlier today, I saw you talking with some grass ninja, she stated. I don't think that's right. They could just be using you. They might do anything to get ahead in the exam. What are you doing? Oh, the boy gestured casually to the bucket of plaster on the floor beside him with the spreading tool in his hand. Just repairing some of the holes in my walls. It makes it less drafty in here. That's nice, the kunoichi mumbled, not really meaning it. So what brings you here? He prompted. Earlier today, I saw you talking with some sand ninja, she stated. Oh yeah, he brightened. Gaara is the youngest son of the Cage, and the other 2 members of his team are his brother and sister, Kankuro and Tamari. Nice folks. Why did you approach them? She demanded, fists clenched in worry. That one with the jug almost killed you. Oh, I just wanted to know why they are going to attack our village, that's all. And being hostile or wanting me dead doesn't make them any different than most of Konoha. Sakura found herself gaping like a fish. Oh, hi Sakura-chan. Naruto called out through the mouthful of nails held between his teeth. What are you doing? She approached, momentarily forgetting why she was there. Oh, I'm just opening up the wall of this room. The apartment next to mine has always been empty, and I got the Hokage's permission to join it to mine so I can have plenty of space for guests to visit. I've got it almost done now. What do you want? Naruto, I just wanted you to know that I saw you flirting with Kiba's sister. That's nice. Could you hand me that wrench please? Baffled at this response, Sakura did so. Why did you do it? Because it was fun. Why do other people flirt? Sakura had no answer to that. Instead she looked around her. Why are we in the basement of your apartment building? Naruto confidently spun the wrench around his fingers before making the last adjustments to the pipes. Because this is where the hot water to my apartment got turned off. I'm just turning it back on again. Oh, I had to replace some rusted through and busted up pipes first, though. Someone must have taken an axe to them to make certain I had cold baths. But I was able to salvage spares from a building that's scheduled for demolition. Oh, Naruto, I had no idea your apartment was this good. Sakura looked about herself in amazement while handing him the screwdriver he'd asked for. Yeah, it does look like kind of a dump from the outside, doesn't it? He said through a couple of screws held between his teeth, lying on his back on two boards between two ladders as he did something to his ceiling. What are you doing up there, anyway? Oh, I'm just finished rewiring the place and I thought this would be a good spot to hang a ceiling fan from. What do you think? She thought about it for a second. Wouldn't it be better over there? I was going to put a sofa there, with a coffee table in front and recliners to either side. The table is going to go here. I thought about carpeting, but I think I prefer hardwood floors with some throw rugs on high traffic areas. Yes, Sakura chirped brightly. I think that would look nice. I'm just saying you should have shown up to the test wearing more than your underwear and a cape, that's all. Sakura insisted. He mumbled, busy fastening upholstery onto a newly assembled recliner frame. Naruto, could you turn that thing off? I've got to talk to you. What is it, Sakura? The boy lifted up his goggles after turning off the power saw on the workbench. She saw it. What are you doing? Making myself a matching dining room set to go with the remodeled kitchen. Don't touch the table, it hasn't had a chance for the varnish to dry yet and I don't want to have to buff out any fingerprints to get a good, high gloss. Oh, she blinked several times in confusion. What did you want to talk about? He asked, going over to check on the clamps that were currently pressing wood for the curved back chairs. Oi, Sakura, something you want to talk about? Yeah, I guess. The kunoichi nervously entered the room where he was working. Just a moment, he cautioned, blowing through the hollow wooden rod to expand the ball of glass on the end into a mold. Okay, you can talk now. What are you doing? Making a set of goblets and glasses to go with my new tableware, why? Immediately on waking up one morning, Naruto created 60 shadow clones that immediately set about performing tasks transforming his house in ways that he himself had practiced up before. 2 more ran off to make purchases around town, including a better set of clothes, a blue outfit based on Kurenai's suggestions. He'd be broke after doing it, but that would reset tomorrow with the rest of it. That afternoon, when he led Hinata to his house for their lunch date, she stood staring, then turned to him with stars in her eyes. I learned how to fix it up since your last visit, he told her, looking the girl fondly in her eyes while gently stroking her chin. Naruto-kun. She leapt into his arms and squeezed him tightly as the romantic atmosphere overwhelmed her. Sighing as it heard this from the next room, the apron-wearing clone in the kitchen turned down the heat on the roast. It looked like dinner would have to be delayed. Sighing fondly as she got told about it later, Kurenai told him, about the only thing you missed was romantic music. Good job Uzumaki. Music? The boy asked her intently. Nothing must be neglected or forgotten in providing the perfect date to the one girl who'd always believed in him. The next morning had Naruto in his sexy disguise, although fully clothed, looking in a music shop window. Both instruments and lessons were each more than he could afford. So, the next question became, how to get more money. He'd show up disguised as the Uchiha, and they'd fall all over themselves to show him around, let him test various instruments, and even give him a complimentary lesson or two, usually lasting for a couple of hours of decent quality instruction. It was sickening, absolutely revolting, favoritism of the worst sort, and still for all of that a very useful loophole for the poor boy to exploit. And he did not need more than a free lesson or two, given that he was in an endless loop of recycling days, one free lesson became an infinite number of them. The music teachers didn't even question as his skill began to rise, assuming it was the rightful privilege of the last Uchiha to know everything. Well, that was a useful weakness he could exploit in other ways, too. Naruto would be the first to admit that he had no martial arts at all. He had no style, no finesse, and absolutely no understanding beyond the 2-year-old, charge the guy and hit him, mindset. Heck, in one of the recent visits to the Inuzuka family clinic, helping out after having lost a bet, he'd gotten into an argument with Kiba about being weak, where the dog user had frankly told him that it didn't matter that Naruto knew the shadow clone, because 1,000 times nothing is still nothing. And, well, in all honesty, the blonde couldn't deny the truth of his friend's statement. What could you expect after years of teachers who would always arrange to send him to the principal, out on bucket duty, scrubbing erasers or otherwise getting him out of the way while the rest of the class practiced their martial arts and weapon techniques? Iruka had put a stop to that, but by then the damage had already been done, and Naruto, having none of the basics, had tried to compensate by sheer enthusiasm and bloody-minded determination, as he had in so many other areas of his life. Well, now Naruto knew better than anyone that guts and determination didn't make up for having no real skill. And really, he'd already sent thousands of untrained clones up against trained fighters only to have them evaporate like soap bubbles before the skilled guy. No, all he could really do was waste a skilled fighter's time. Even with all of his basic ninja techniques fully mastered, thanks to Ebisu, all he could really do was waste more of the guy's time. He wasn't presenting any danger to the enemy ninja he fought, even when he fought for real. It was depressing, but another thing Naruto had learned was that you could not correct a situation until you accepted what it really was, no matter how much you might not want to face it. And being nothing more than a punching bag on a battlefield was something he felt had to be corrected, and soon. Taking a hit wasn't so serious a weakness for most people using the shadow clone, because taking a hit in combat was usually a very bad thing. Getting a kunai stuck in your chest was a big deal, whether or not you were a clone. So most fighters could go a long time before taking a hit at all. They'd learn to avoid it. It was an integral part of knowing how to fight well. But Naruto didn't know how to fight at all, not with any style, anyway. He'd always plowed forward, shrugging off hits and damage to go smack his enemy. No wonder his clones didn't last long. So he began a plan of attending sets of drills where he practiced with some academy students while under a transformation disguise as they got taught basic combat techniques at classes Naruto had somehow never been invited to. All he had to know was who was out sick that day and hadn't bothered to tell anyone, even if he had to arrange the sick day by tying up the students in question himself. First off, he did this with the poorest students in the lowest grades, that way his own ignorance did not stand out at all. Then, as he gained some degree of competence, he replaced better and older pupils. After he'd done that enough to have a decent grasp of the basics, he would use disguises to impersonate top students and approach teachers for special one-on-one training. It embarrassed him that one of those top students was Konohamaru. But the kid had been having personal instruction under Ebisu for years. Actually, on that note, he deliberately sought out Ebisu disguised as Konohamaru a few times to help get a handle on the basics, because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that Ebisu taught basics relentlessly and well. Although he got a little ashamed at how surprised and pleased the special Jonin got that his prize pupil Konohamaru was listening intently for once. That embarrassment behind him, he sought out Iruka as himself for similar treatment. It shocked the Chunin how much his former pupil had improved, so Naruto told him he'd been seeking private lessons, which, in a way, was true. But even so, there was only so much those two would teach him while still believing he was the person he was passing himself off as, even himself. Still, even after months wherein he'd exhausted all of what the Ninja Academy could do to teach about armed and unarmed fighting, that still only brought him up to where a genin should be. Hey, it was miles above where he'd been before, and it was a top-notch rookie genin he'd ended up impersonating at the end, the best in the academy, so that's where his skill level topped out, as that was where he'd exhausted this opportunity for instruction. But that skill level still wasn't going to make much of a difference against the sort of things he'd been having to fight against. In fact, just to see, he tried his new skills out on Orochimaru, and the snake Sanin didn't even notice the change. Even the charge of 1,000 skilled genin did not faze him any more than the previous charges of 1,000 unskilled berserkers. Either way, he'd cut them down like grass. But that wasn't the point. No, the point of this whole exercise was still on exploiting what the generous townspeople would give to the Uchiha, usually without question, and glad for the opportunity to do so. And, well, no one who was capable of teaching fighting arts would believe that Sasuke wasn't already a skilled genin. So, now having the fighting skills a proper genin should, and that Sasuke had been using months ago, Naruto was in a position to approach instructors and ask for training. It was sickening how easily he got it, too. However, just as he was on the cusp of great success, he hit a wall and his hopes came crashing down on him. Because the really good instructors noticed something that the ones at the academy never did, Naruto had never internalized those lessons in the way a good fighter had to. Fighting was a very physical art. In order to be good at it, the body itself had to know what it was doing. But due to the endless repeats, nothing physical stayed with him. He couldn't condition his body, nor could he train reflexes. And that was a problem, because the body needed to know what it was going to do. Naruto had trained his mind until it knew it very well, but that wasn't good enough. At that level he was still thinking about what he had to do to get it right. No, to be good at a physical skill like martial arts required the body itself to have conditioned reflexes so the mind didn't have to think about every step and motion along the way. You'd never get any real speed or free up the mind to think tactically until the complex motions of the actual forms, the stances, punches, blocks and so on, were automatic. The really good instructors wouldn't touch him until he had that, no matter whose face and form he wore, or how perfect the disguise was. They could tell the moment they started teaching him that he was missing that basic and essential element. And even the good ones who stuck with him after that discovery would think only of how to teach it to him. That meant practice, 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 endlessly repeating the proper forms. Only, in Naruto's case, after a reset his muscles wouldn't recall a bit of it. He wasn't sore or tired, but his muscles wouldn't retain the benefit either. And sadly, without that, he was as good as he was going to get, at least as far as the fighting arts were concerned. He wasn't even half as good as he could have been at the same level of knowledge, if only he'd been able to practice in ways that could effectively train his body. In fact, one of those teachers told him straight out that he'd be twice as good as he was now, using only what he already knew, if only his body knew it all as well as his mind did. The teacher had been trying to encourage him, as twice as good as the top academy student, whom he'd been impersonating to get his instruction of late, was almost as good as a rookie Chunin ought to be, which would put him in the ballpark of where he wanted to be, because he was still taking that test. But instead of encourage him, it ended up having the opposite effect. Naruto had been basing so many hopes on his infinite ability to achieve, using repeats to improve and get better, overcoming all of his former problems and become a better ninja, that to run into a barrier he couldn't cross, on something so basic and fundamental to all of his goals, was difficult not to be shattered by. It was made especially bad by the fact that he'd always fancied himself a close combat ninja, one who'd go right in there and mix it up with an enemy, and his main strategy and primary technique all reflected this. Then to be faced with this, having hit an uncrossable ceiling on his martial arts talents just when he was beginning to feel he could be good at it, and the sure knowledge that if he wanted to improve further he'd have to abandon further progress on that one path and reinvent himself as a ninja. It was a crushing blow to his self-esteem, and merited a Hinata day or two back-to-back just to recover from the hurt of it. Even so, he'd had to cry a bit before he could get over it and accept his new handicap. By the time he'd hit the same limit on his musical studies he was almost resigned to it, having somewhat expected it. But it still hurt. So he still took a week off of any serious training to have a prank vacation to make up for it. Luckily, he could still learn chakra techniques and ninja powers, as those didn't seem to be hurt by a lack of body memory. Naruto had real trouble reinventing himself. It was not that he couldn't think of other types of ninja, but that he'd always been aiming to be Hokage, and a cage-level ninja couldn't afford any major weaknesses. Weaknesses like, having genin-level martial arts. Still, he didn't give up hope that he could improve them eventually. It just wasn't going to happen during this time loop thingy. After that, he could go forward with his original plans to impersonate Sasuke to get people to teach him. He'd just have to be more careful not to get caught doing it, as he didn't want to be a cage-level missing ninja. No, okay, that was sounding too risky. Maybe he could somehow arrange to find a person who was willing to teach him despite being a demon container. That would prove better in the long run. But that was getting distracted from his immediate goals. A Hokage had to be strong in many areas, and martial arts was only one. He could and would deal with that later. For right now, there were plenty of other weaknesses he could be working on improving with the opportunities at hand. For example, there were ninja medics, ninja who focused on special moves or secret powers, elemental wielders, and even illusion specialists. Getting people to teach him cool special moves had been a goal all along, and it hadn't been turning up much. So it seemed best to look to other areas, at least until something opened up. Other than the basic clone technique, Naruto knew next to nothing about illusions, except what Ebisu had said about his transformation not having those same vulnerabilities. He knew that they required power, something he had a lot of, imagination, another area in which he was gifted, and skill. Well, of the lot, the only area he wasn't already well supplied in was skill, and that could be remedied. The only thing now was some instructions to follow, and he could get started. And, it just so happened that one of those people the Hokage was regularly sending him off to learn under was Kurenai, who was an illusion specialist. Feeling buoyed up by this new hope, Naruto bounced up out of bed and set off to go see Kurenai. I. Holding a letter from the Hokage in her hands, the illusion mistress was speaking in a somewhat resigned tone of voice. The problem, Uzumaki, is that not everyone can learn to use illusions, certainly not the higher-ranking ones. You need a good imagination, which I'm sure you have, but also good chakra control, which I'm just as sure you don't. The boy took a deep breath and responded reasonably, "Are you sure you can't give me some test? I've got the basic clone fully mastered, and without the use of seals. I'm willing to work hard," he pled. The Jonin sighed. She hated giving kids bad news, but this one practically pled for it. "Okay, show me your clone." He did, and she was impressed. It appeared before she'd even finished asking, and the kid hadn't used any hand seals to do it. The tiniest wisp of smoke was the only sign of its appearance, and without that she would have suspected the kid of having already hid a clone around a corner just waiting for her to ask before bringing it out. "I'm impressed." She nodded her head. "That's as good a clone as I've ever found. The problem is all of the other illusions are at least a full rank higher." "How good is your chakra control, really?" "Above average," he told her earnestly, leaving out the barely part of that Ebisu had tacked on when he'd told him his grade, because when he did tack it on she'd turn him down based on that. Of course, he'd been about as low on control as you could get before the whole time loop thing, and since she didn't know about the loops, but had heard about his abysmal control through the Jonin grapevine, she didn't believe what he'd said, thinking he was just trying to butter her up. "Show me," she told him straight out. "How?" he pled, and when she began to look at him askance he blurted, "The leaf floating exercise." "Sure. No problem. I can do wall and water walking too, if you want me to." Plainly doubtful, she motioned for him to continue, and so he took a fresh leaf out of his pouch before causing it to hover above his forehead, where he held it with only minor spins or wobbles. It was good, but not good enough. Kurenai was a little surprised. "You were right. You do have above average chakra control, if only barely." She didn't see him hide his wince as she stood up. "But when I said good control I meant it. Sorry, Uzumaki, but I really do need a student to have good control, or I'd just be wasting my time." "Waste 1 hour. Just 1 hour." He pled with her again, this time clasping his hands together and dropping to his knees, making the Jonin feel terrible about it as she shook her head and departed, leaving Naruto alone. The boy sighed, dropping his pose and feeling depressed. This conversation had been the product of numerous repeats where he'd been trying to convince her and learning how to play her reactions to gain the best of all possible chances. Not even showing her his unique transformation helped, as she was able to pick it out as not an illusion right off the bat, and she was only going to qualify him based on illusions, or better chakra control than he had. He'd asked for less time before, but the illusion mistress had said she couldn't give a complete lesson in less than an hour. So, maybe illusions would have to wait a while. There were also, he reflected, seals. And one of the greatest known masters of that specialty was in Konoha right now, peeping on bathhouses. But since Jiraiya would not teach him anything else, he doubted he'd teach him that. Sigh. Back to Ebisu for more chakra control, he figured. Since it was still early in the day, and he'd passed the written test, the only times he got a note to see Hinata's teacher from the Hokage were when he'd passed the written test. It would be another 2-day wait before he could see the special Jonin again if he went by the ordinary schedule. Not wanting to delay that long, Naruto forged a note to Ebisu from the Hokage. He'd seen it often enough to be able to copy it with his eyes closed. It would get caught later, not having any of the proper security seals, but it could have non-functional copies written on, and by the time they caught it he'd have already reset anyway. Naruto had been meeting with Ebisu far less often of late. It wasn't that he didn't want to know what the special Jonin had to teach him, but that most of the things he taught were ones he'd learned already. The same pointers and exercises to perfect one technique were often the same ones he'd taught him to perfect another. So, really, he didn't have to visit him as often to get the same value. What Naruto would do was practice on his own during normal hours of his daily schedule while busy doing other things, checking in periodically with the teaching specialist to make sure he was on the right path. But really, he'd gotten good enough at teaching himself that only rarely did the special Jonin have something to say that contradicted what he'd already been doing. So, it saved time and was less frustrating to go through the exercises and drills and stuff for perfecting his techniques on his own. Still, it was an old and tired routine even so, showing up and going through the motions of the tests Ebisu gave him, turning this way, then that, lifting one leg, and assuming martial arts stances which were now substantially improved over what he'd originally done, but that only served to remind him of that barrier he couldn't cross, and irritate him further. Very well, tell me what techniques you already know. Naruto sighed, beginning again the litany. My basic 3 are fully mastered, seal-less and almost traceless. Body flicker likewise. I also know the shadow clone, and 2 unique distraction techniques of my own devising, but you already know about those, the boy finished with a knowing grin. Ebisu coughed and adjusted his glasses, attempting to master a slight blush. Yes, well. Naruto smiled. That jibe was intentional, and had often saved him from an hour of tests as his teacher made him prove those claims. It also saved him from having to reveal his transformation was an S-rank solid variant rather than the usual illusionary one. Apparently deciding something, the teacher casually pulled a scroll out of his pouch and tossed it to him. Here, that is a treatise on basic elemental tips and chakra control exercises. Why don't you practice that for a while? As the special Jonin walked off, leaving him, Naruto's face was screwed up in agony and his fists were clenched tightly over the scroll. You mean this guy had that with him the entire time? It was all he could do not to follow after Ebisu and hit the guy. Mastering his ire, the boy sat down to memorize that scroll, not just read it, but completely commit the contents to memory so he didn't have to do the whole routine with Ebisu to see it again. His memory had been substantially improved by his time stuck in all of these repeating days, and it had gotten better faster once he'd unlocked some of his mental power after he'd begun to really read. But, bless the library, there had been a few books in there on enhancing memory. It was a shinobi village, after all, and they often had need to remember things without writing them down. So he put himself to work memorizing that scroll, and would call himself done only once he could copy it out by hand from memory. After that, he'd start to work on those things it described. He fell asleep in the forest while still studying that scroll. For the second time in his life, Naruto opened his eyes to a person bending over him, after having slept all night in a forest, exhausted from too much training. Hi, you know it isn't safe to be out here all night. There are bears and things in these forests. Groaning, Naruto sat up, looking at who'd addressed him. Tenten, right, on the same team as Neji and Rock Lee. The girl was surprised. Yeah, how do you know? I make a point of learning about those around me, particularly those who might be stronger than me. It's a good ninja strategy. He waved airily. The girl laughed, tilting her head to say, sorry, but you don't look like a very good ninja, with that grass and leaves in your hair. Tactfully, she didn't state that his reputation as a dead last was well known around the village, spread by people crowing in delight over how weak he was. That's okay, he knew it too. I thought the point of being a ninja was deception. The boy shot back with a wide, friendly grin, running fingers through his hair to get the leaves out. The girl thought about it and conceded, okay, what do you know about me? The boy shrugged, and sat there, thinking. Well, obviously I know about your team and John an instructor, but that's not so much about you, is it? You hang out with Neji a lot and train alongside him because neither of you want to train at the pace that Lee or your instructor set. You specialize in weaponry, and your teacher says that you can hit a bullseye 100 out of 100 times. Most of your weapons you summon from scrolls you carry with you, and your most powerful technique is your rising twin dragons, where you jump up high summoning dozens of weapons out of 2 scrolls which you throw in a really fast barrage at your target. By now the female genin was surprised. That kid really did know some stuff about her. But Naruto wasn't finished. He was scratching his head. Some girls around town say you have a crush on Neji, but don't think he returns it. You want to prove that female ninja can be as strong as males ones, and you admire Tsunade, the slug Sanin. Wow, you really do know a lot about me. The girl was impressed, and trying hard to hide both her blush at the crush thing, and her disappointment that her peers felt she wasn't getting through to the Hyuga boy. Reading her face expertly, Naruto felt a little ashamed and tried to soften the blow. Don't worry too much about the Neji thing. The guy can be a bit of a pain, but he's really unhappy himself. The Hyuga family have this big thing where the main house are rulers over the branch house, who they treat like slaves. They even put a brand on their forehead, a seal that can kill them if they disobey. Neji's father was the twin of the clan head, but because he was born a few seconds later he got stuck in the branch house. He resents Hinata because he doesn't think she is strong enough to be in the main house. And then his dad got sacrificed to save the life of his twin, who is her father. So, yeah, he's got issues. He tried to finish off with a merry chuckle, but it came out sounding nervous. Tenten's eyes were wide. How did he know all this? She'd been a teammate of Neji's for over a year now and never heard any of this. I'm kinda dating Hinata right now, Naruto concluded lamely to cover the question he could see in her eyes. The whole thing upsets her. Concluding that he had to be right, girls were more talkative than boys, the girl relaxed, then changed the subject. So what are you doing out here all alone? Happy to be back on a safe topic, and deciding he could even tell the truth, Naruto held up the scroll he'd been studying. Oh, training to be a better ninja. I don't have many techniques, and this was supposed to help me. I guess I got so tired reading it that I fell asleep. He. She smiled at him. Tenten turned out to be a wealth of information on useful techniques no one had ever taught the village pariah. Like Naruto, she didn't have many special ninja powers, but she did have her signature technique of storage seals. Like Naruto, the girl was something of a combat expert, although ranged instead of melee. And, also like Naruto, the one power she did have made her more effective at her specialty. But where he spammed a battle with clones to augment his effectiveness, she used storage seals on scrolls to carry far more weaponry than she could otherwise lift, much less control. But both of them were combat multipliers, making them better at that which they could already do. He threw more punches, and she threw more weapons thanks to their signature techniques. And yet, it was one of those sorts of situations where each one could add to the other. Hey, Tenten. How about we teach each other our moves? You mean, I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours? She giggled. Something like that. He looked away, embarrassed. It just struck me, how my technique and yours could add to each other, 'cause a shadow clone can throw loads of weapons, too. So, in a way, we'd both get the best out of each of them if we added our techniques together. Yeah, that makes sense, she agreed. Great, he agreed. Then with a bamf of smoke after forming a hand seal, a clone of him appeared and started to write. I'll have him write down the shadow clone technique so you can study it at your leisure. Now you go. Okay, the girl blinked. I guess that works. The boy shrugged. Well, it took me a couple of hours to learn shadow clone and they tell me I'm exceptionally fast, that most take weeks. I'll be glad to help you study it later, but I think you'll need some time to look it over. Okay, she chirruped far more happily. So let's get started. Do you have a blank scroll on you? We can use the back side of this one. It's blank. He held up Ebisu's scroll. That works. She laughed, and they got started. Naruto had always had an exceptionally fast learning curve once someone actually taught him something, and Tenten was a good teacher. Soon he had the basics mastered, he didn't even need a repeat to get that far. In fact, they hadn't used up all of their morning before the test started. And that raised his ninja techniques from 5 to 6, although seals were in a special category that people didn't often list when they counted special moves. Still, that didn't make him any less glad to have it. And the way Tenten explained it, storage seals were massively useful, too. You could carry camping gear and supplies on long missions, spares for your normal equipment, like clean clothes, and even hot food, all without weighing yourself down or losing speed. It made most of the worst aspects of being on long assignments almost not difficult at all. It was, in its own way, just as helpful as being able to create a million copies of yourself. One of those force multiplier thingies. Only, since they each gave benefit a different way the bonuses stacked. And, in a little less than an hour, Naruto was doing well enough at it to get by. Now that he knew the difference between a crude performance and a refined technique, he wouldn't call himself an expert at storage seals, and Tenten most certainly was. But she taught him well enough to get by on. Reading together and discussing the shadow clone scroll he'd made for her took another 10 minutes, before she agreed she wasn't ready to try that just yet, as it did sound pretty difficult. However, they still had a great deal of time in what she'd allotted for her morning training schedule, so he joined her for that and started learning how to throw weapons effectively. They covered only a tiny bit of that at the academy, just enough to get you started, really. Also, they stuck primarily with the kunai, that all-purpose ninja tool, apparently thinking that anyone who wanted to know more could learn on their own. Tenten had. That girl could throw anything, even things that ordinarily could not be employed effectively as thrown weapons, like sickles and long swords. She taught him a lot, cheerful all the while, but Naruto had a long way to go before he'd be anywhere near as good, and probably never could be quite as good given the muscle memory limits he had to work under. Still, he could get somewhere in that skill, and he intended to. Even if he could only have the basics that was still going to be useful. After all, he could only crowd so many clones in punching range around a target at once, but if they stood back and threw weapons, well, they could do more. So he made certain he knew how to train further in this by himself before they moved on. She even dropped hints that a person could steer weapons with wires, and that sounded fascinating. After all, a number of very deadly things could be done with wires, the trick was getting an opponent to blunder into them. But if the wires delivered themselves, attached to weapons, double bonus. He'd have to learn more about that. In fact, he'd just found a new specialty he wanted to study. And, what's more, she seemed eager to teach him, almost surprised that anyone would value her skill enough to want to learn it. That any girl so talented could have confidence problems amazed him, but no longer surprised him. Look at Hinata, loveliest, nicest girl in their class, and all but ignored by all and sundry. He wished he could say he wasn't equally to blame for that. Hey, Naruto, Tenten asked as they were walking away after training. Yeah, he turned his attention to the girl he was rapidly becoming fond of. So few had treated him decently, let alone shared their techniques with him so readily, that he knew he would be spending a great deal of time with her in the future. Pity that she wouldn't remember it. That seal thing the Hyuga put on the branch house members? She asked. When one of them gets married, do they put it on their wives? I dunno, the boy answered honestly. They might, but I'd have to find out to know for sure. Could you? It's kinda important to me. Sure. I know they put it on little kids, though. I think Neji got his when he was about 4, or 6, or so. Tenten scowled at the thought of anyone doing that to children. No way was someone going to enslave her kids. But, darn it, if Neji was a slave, then Neji couldn't stop them from doing that to his kids. Which meant, if she didn't want it to happen to her kids, she couldn't marry Neji. Tenten sighed, giving up on that dream. And it hurt, too. Then she perked up. Say, want to come back to my place? You've got to get something to eat before we go to that training area 44 thing later today, and I feel I owe you one for all of this information. Sure, he agreed, then sobered instantly on thinking about the test. Oh, and Tenten, about our test. It's a week-long survival mission inside a forest where all of the genin are trying to kill each other. Each team starts with one half of the mission requirement, and you have to get the other from some other team. No holds barred. There's going to be a lot of death. At least half of those who enter are going to fail, and most who fail will probably die. Her face hardened. That was hard tactical data, priceless in ninja terms. Thanks, Naruto. But there's more, he cautioned. The teams from Sand and Sound are particularly deadly. Both have attacks you've never seen before. The Sound guys you could probably take if your whole team hit them hard and fast, but they're no ordinary genin. The Sand team, he shuddered. They'll kill you. I've seen Gaara, the lead on the Sand team, fight, and he could take down Lee even if he'd opened all the celestial gates he could. He's no genin, unleashed at full power he's closer to cage rank. Not even Neji would stand a chance. By now the girl was done being surprised that he had such information on her team. It seemed like he was right, he had been disguising his skill and secretly gathering information. So she was all ninja as she asked, what does he do? He animates sand. I know it doesn't sound like much, but he can move a few tons of that stuff like it was a part of him, reaching and grabbing, crushing and killing. If it touches you, it's over. It also forms a shield around him. Your weapons would be useless. Not even Lee's best punches could penetrate all of the way. And the girl on that team is also bad news for you. She's a wind mistress, and has ability to knock flying things out of the air, things like thrown weapons. She'd be able to shut down even your rising twin dragons. If you do have to fight her, do it some other way than by throwing things. She nodded, absorbing the tactical brief and analyzing it already. And the third? Konkuro, he responded. A puppet user. Basic strategy is to hide and let his puppet do all of the fighting. He'd be much less of a threat if you could tell which was him and which was his puppet, but he's expert at making that hard. It's strong and got built-in weapons, and can take a fearsome beating. If you could fight the guy himself, though, he isn't too bad. Best bet would be to strike him hard by surprise, before he deploys it. But considering the rest of his team, I'd avoid combat altogether. He's great at throwing delays and diversions at people, and the other two would finish you off. The girl is nearly unbeatable at a distance, and Gaara is suicide to face at close to mid-ranges. Together, their team hasn't got any exploitable weaknesses. Again she was nodding. Hey, Naruto, do you mind if I just drop you by at my place while I get some errands done? You can wash up, and I'll be back to get you that breakfast I promised, I just have some things to do first. Sure, no problem, he chirruped gladly. They both knew she'd be running off to give her team his warnings. What he didn't know was that she had a keen enough memory to repeat it word for word, even complete with tonal inflection. She trained to be in infiltration once, briefly, before they'd told her that female infiltrators usually had to sleep with their marks. But one of the skills of an infiltrator was to know memory tricks like that, and she'd gotten them. Naruto wasn't the only one to use those memory techniques taught by books in the library. It was a shinobi village, and they had many who had an interest in remembering things without writing them down. Of course, in the perverse way of things, she would tell her team and Lee would go tell Sakura. Who'd tell Sasuke, but only after asking Ino if she had heard. And Ino would tell her team, while Neji would feel obliged to inform the main house, who'd instruct Hinata, who'd tell her team, and so the rumors would spread like wildfire through Konoha practically word for word, until at the meeting outside the Forest of Death every Konoha genin, and some few from other villages who'd kept an ear to the ground, was outfitted for a long stay in wilderness terrain, carrying extra weapons and in some cases armor. Many would be carrying a written form of Naruto's warning that someone had copied onto paper and distributed, some even falling into other hands. There was also a wide gap around the Sound and Sand teams, with people eyeing the Sand trio with respectful hostility out of the corners of their eyes. Those few who didn't already know what was up noticed and asked, so got whispered too, and the circle around the Sand team grew wider. Some specifics hadn't made the rounds. So rather than Gaara could take down Lee even if he'd opened all the celestial gates, it was transmitted as he could take down a Jonin easily, while the Neji part was simply dropped. Still, it was an effective message, and people were already plotting out evasion strategies. They were ninja. If something was too tough to fight, you went around it just like any other obstacle to your mission. I've got to find Gaara. I must grow by defeating strong opponents. You know his powers are all based on a bloodline, don't you? Naruto asked, disturbed by this change. There's nothing there you could copy. I've seen him, he just stands there while his sand moves and kills people. You've seen him? Sakura asked, disbelieving. Yeah. Naruto shrugged. It was like Haku and his ice mirrors, only 1,000 times worse. That Gaara guy gets off on killing. From what I've heard even his own village is terrified of him, and that includes his siblings, who make up his team. That guy likes killing the same way you like Sasuke. It defines his whole being. Our Hokage might not even be able to take that guy down. Really? Sakura, at least, was frightened. Sasuke was not. I've read the reports, and don't believe them. He's just a genin. With my Sharingan I could destroy him. Naruto blew out a long sigh, rolling his eyes. It's your funeral. Finding Gaara's team was easy. If Naruto hadn't already had transformed clones following all of the teams in, he would have now. The one following the grass genin, the ones Orochimaru and his cronies had replaced, died as usual, but in the ongoing effort to track him, there was always another place just where the last one had lost him. There had to be something the Sannin could sense about them, because he never failed to notice one of his clones for long. And he'd change course in order to evade the emplaced ones. He was, Naruto reflected, a master at this. An evil, sadistic and sick-looking bastard, but also a master ninja. Still, of all of the things Gaara was, hyper-aware of his surroundings he was not. The Sand team wasn't even particularly on their guard, waltzing in like a pack of lions at a sheep festival. They had good reason to, the comparison was an apt one. No team Naruto was aware of well, except the Sannin, but he didn't count, could present a credible threat to them. What was unusual was that this time around the other teams seemed to be aware of that, and were departing from their usual schedules to avoid the Sand team whenever and wherever they made contact. This was starting to frustrate Gaara to no end. He wanted death and blood, and by gum he was going to get it. Fortunately for the homicidal insomniac and his two increasingly nervous siblings, who'd begun to fear, and rightfully so, that Gaara might turn on them just to sat a bit of his bloodthirst, Sasuke was enough of a egomaniac loon that he actually thought he could beat them, despite all of the testimony to the contrary. No, to Sasuke's mind there was no other form of life half as good as an Uchiha. So, being naturally superior to all other creatures out there, he was going to take down their best and impress them all. Just to show them. A suicidal form of egomania, as there had been plenty of Uchihas killed in battle against those same, lesser creatures, before. After all, there had been a whole clan of them at one point, and never had one of them been Hokage, or called the best ninja of the village. The Sharingan had weaknesses, not the least of which seemed to be the habit of those who had it to overestimate themselves. Sasuke himself had been so paralyzed from killer intent alone by Zabuza that he'd been ready to commit suicide on the spot until Kakashi reassured him. But that didn't stop his arrogance now. It was as if he could no longer even recall that event. And what made matters worse, Sasuke's feelings of innate superiority and invincibility were only exceeded by Sakura's feelings on the same subject, namely, that her crush was superior to all other creatures and invincible. Between the two of them they created a very dangerous delusion, that led very quickly to Team 7 standing on one side of a clearing, with the Sand siblings on the other. And Gaara hadn't killed anything all day. He was feeling overdue. His tone was very low and level, a danger sign to all who knew him, when the container for the one-tailed beast said, "You are here to validate my existence." Naruto rolled his eyes when Sasuke walked forward to pose and brag, "I am Sasuke Uchiha. I care nothing for your existence." Sasuke shot a hard glare over his shoulder at Naruto, whom he'd overheard whisper, "Truer words were never spoken." Turning back to face the Sand team, this time with a deeper scowl on his face, the Uchiha bragged, "I am going to defeat you and claim what is mine by right. As a Chunin of Konoha I will have more power to defeat my brother, and then I will revive my clan. Go Sasuke." Sakura bounced up and down twice, cheering. "Oi, Temari!" Naruto shouted through cupped hands. "Do you want to step aside and talk with me while your brother slaughters my teammate? You know Gaara's going to win, so I have no point in fighting you, since my team will be disqualified anyway. What do you say, Naruto?" Sakura tried to bonk him on the head, only for the blonde guy to dodge her attempt, laughing. Sasuke was glaring at him in disgust, while the Sand team didn't know what to say. Already Naruto was skipping a significant distance over to the side, pulling out the dining room set he'd made for himself and putting a feast on the surface. "Hey, Kankuro, you're invited, too. There's more here than she and I can eat. I'd ask Gaara to the table but no, I'd die before I could leave it again. So I think if he wants to eat he's going to have to wait until I can scurry off into the forest like a frightened rabbit. I don't feel like being crushed to death today." Once a check with Gaara proved he didn't care, the Sand siblings left his side, smirking, to join Naruto at the meal. "Thanks." Kankuro picked up a slice of roast and popped it into his mouth, chewing for a moment before he added potatoes and gravy, vegetables and juice to his palate. No one else would have noticed the slight signal he gave to Temari, who only then chose to seat herself, but Naruto had figured the puppet master would send in his toy first. He hadn't known it could test food for poison, evidently it could. But, strangers in a strange village and all, he guessed he couldn't blame them for being prepared. Out of curiosity, he watched to see if he could tell when the real Kankuro would switch in for his dummy. The food was excellent, and Temari was making no secret of that as she joined the Konoha genin in digging in. Out on the playing field, a drama was beginning to develop. "Who is your brother? I will kill him for you," Gaara softly stated as he stared at his most recent prey. "Only I get to slay my brother," Sasuke snarled. "Only an Uchiha can kill an Uchiha. Go Sasuke." Sakura pumped a fist. "So, what kind of craftsmen do you guys have in Sand? I know you can't grow crops there, so you import most of your food, so I figure you have something to export." Naruto conversed reasonably, after pouring himself some juice. "Steel, mostly," Kankuro chomped with his mouth full of rolls. "We've got tons of the stuff near the surface, just covered by sand, metals of all kinds actually. Our weapons are good enough, most of you guys in Konoha use them." "Really? I didn't know that. Where do you get the carbon from? I know iron comes out of the ground, but..." "Shish." Temari hushed them. "Give your teammates some respect. Those are his last words out there, after all." A vein was pumping on Sasuke's head at not being the center of drama. He chose to ignore the sideshow for now and focus on the real opponent, and the glory it would gain him to defeat him. Then Naruto had to take even that away by cupping his hands and shouting, "His brother is Itachi Uchiha. Now get on with it, or are you planning to bore him to death?" Sasuke's fists were trembling and he nearly broke his staring contest with Gaara to go over and clobber his teammate. Sakura was not so restrained. "A lot of it's in the ash we get as a byproduct from running our forges. We do have mines for coal, otherwise we'd be stuck importing wood, and the prices would break us." Kankuro continued, as if he'd not been interrupted, having his dummy trip and immobilize Sakura, muffling her screams as she shouted over the outrage of it all. "Actually, it's hard enough as it is. I can imagine," Naruto empathized. "And can I just say how impressed I am that in spite of how closely I'd watched you, I hadn't caught the change of position between master and puppet." "Thank you," Kankuro demurred. "Can you pass the butter?" "Certainly." "Oh, yes, I'd forgotten dairy products don't ship well. You must not see many of them in Sand." "More than you'd think," the puppet master said around a mouthful of buttered potato. Tamari couldn't help herself and broke down laughing helplessly at the sight of it all, this casual conversation over the backdrop of her brother's murder. Gaara himself was finding this a unique experience, which is why he'd not rushed things further. But no point in waiting any more. He spoke softly to Sasuke, "I will kill your brother, because you will be unable to." "No, it is my destiny. I must defeat Itachi," Sasuke shouted. "No," Gaara disagreed. "You are mistaken. You have no destiny. You are already dead." That was when the Uchiha felt what was going on at last. Sometime during this conversation, sand had crept up over his toes, climbed up his legs and was entering his shorts. At the very moment he noticed it, the pool of sand around his ankles made a lunge and captured the lower half of his body. He struggled, but he was already tightly bound, his hands trapped beside him as the sand lifted him into the air. Gaara's voice continued soft. "You will not be reviving your clan, either." Blood spurted from the trapped Uchiha as Gaara's sand crushed Sasuke's balls. "Yes." Naruto pumped a fist. "I am definitely making sure this happens again." Even his tablemates stared at him oddly after that pronouncement. Moments later, Sasuke too had met his demise, his Sharingan useless against Gaara's sand, having already been trapped before he was aware of danger. "So," Naruto turned back urbanely to his conversation. "What kind of fan is that, Tamari? Is it special made? Where do you get them done?" Later, marching away from the strange luncheon, having given up their scroll and heading toward the exits while the Sand siblings went on to the tower, Sakura was glaring holes in him, refusing to speak. "Oh, give it a rest," the boy chided. "I didn't actually bring my dining room set with me today," Naruto admitted. "So instead I transformed a few clones into replicas of them. If Sasuke had one it would have been easy to detain or give the others crippling injuries, since they were already, literally, in my laps at the time I'd be revealing my trap." The next day, after the reset, walking past the pair of disguised Chunin on his way to the written test as usual, but thinking about the events of the last time through, Naruto paused and asked, pointing toward the door. "Okay, I know that is an illusion, and you two are Chunin. So how do you do that?" The pair of disguised Chunin snorted. "What? The door? It's called the veil technique, and with it you can cloak small areas in a different appearance." "So, how do you do it?" He pressed with just enough eagerness to get their egos stroked. One of them shrugged. "It's not hard, only a D rank technique. Mostly you just take a standard transformation and project it outward. You have to stay nearby or it falls to pieces, and it costs more chakra to keep active. But it can be useful to fool clueless goons, like most of you hopefuls." "And the hand seals. Here," one of them showed him. "Now get out of the way and don't clue in anyone else. We have a job to do, weeding out the unfit." Having liked the last set of events he'd set in motion, Naruto decided to repeat it for a while. That meant passing the test and forging a note to Ebisu so he could get the scroll so he wouldn't look odd to Tenten when she woke him up in the morning after sleeping outside in the forest. They'd trained together, and pretty soon he had the basics of all of her tricks down. All that was left from that point was to refine and practice them, but doing so he got to be good friends to her. She didn't remember him past any resets, obviously, but as he learned to like her and know her better, he was able to learn her buttons and impress her and build a surprisingly good relationship in a fairly short time. While obviously not in the same boat as him, Tenten was a very lonely girl and eager to have more friends. He found it easy to respond to that, and soon was seeking her out for more than just training. There were also those conversations, learning everything he could from the sand team. And the entertainment value of seeing Sasuke's balls crushed over and over somehow never grew tiresome. It just kept getting funnier every time he saw it. He'd even spooked Gaara once over how hard he'd laughed while Sasuke got gelded. But it was all for training purposes, really. He had to repeat it all that way, because, yes, there was no other way to get the Sand siblings to the table, that was it. Useful information and all. It was just a side benefit that seeing the psychopathic insomniac creeped out by him was a hoot all on its own. But forming a few hundred shadow clones into a harem variant that had them all dressed like cheerleaders, and having them all loudly celebrate the Sand Demon's victory jumping about waving pom-poms wasn't too much, now was it? No, there had been some times in there where he'd really disturbed Gaara. As far as training, things were going swimmingly there, between Tenten's help and Ebisu's scroll. Plus, he also had a significant personal project on his own he was fitting in on the side. Learning how to project a transformation technique when what he did wasn't a standard transformation was a fair bit of work. He tried his own as a basis and it didn't work, or at least it wasn't possible given what knowledge he had. Luckily, at least no one was out to stop him from learning an academy-level technique, so he could go ask Iruka or look it up himself to learn the basic transformation, the real one this time, in addition to his own version. For simplicity's sake, he decided to call the academy version the disguise technique within himself, because that was all it did, and his own shapeshift, as that was equally descriptive. Picking up the disguise technique was easy by now, as was perfecting it, as he already knew all of the ins and outs and tricks for it, having done it all already for his own, much harder version. His improved chakra control over his academy days helped a fair bit, too. From there it really wasn't too hard to take it that one step further and get a version of the veil going. Knowing the internal workings of the disguise, as he did, made the rest of it seem easy. His experience with the shadow clone also helped him quite a lot, and his mastery of the basic clone also pushed his knowledge along, as that one already dealt with a projected illusion. Really he found it so easy he was surprised that it wasn't harder. Oh, there were a great many details to work out yet, blurred edges and all of the things Ebisu had named, but he was able to get something going quickly. And that gave him a significant hope, as between his disguise and the new veil he'd have 3 illusions to show off to Kurenai. Mastering them wouldn't be too difficult after all he'd already done, and with 3 good, solid illusions to show her instead of 1 he'd have a greatly increased chance to convince her to accept him as a student, even if just for 1 hour. 1 hour, that he could be infinitely repeating. No, his chances for acquiring a specialty were definitely looking up. Even if it would be months of work on his own to get these perfect, he now had a route to follow that he could work on that led to a definite hope of success. It would have been enough by itself to keep him interested, but there was also training alongside Tenten in the mornings. Also, at the same time, he was getting to know Tamari and Kankuro more on the other end of that same schedule, having bizarre lunches with them while Gaara squeezed Sasuke's balls to mush before crushing him to death, and the Sand siblings were also surprisingly good people, once you got to know them. Perversely, they were almost as lonely as Naruto was, and for almost exactly the same reasons. On that surprising basis, he found himself building something of the same odd friendship he had with Tenten with them. Naruto learned to love Kankuro's sense of humor, and found flirting with Tamari so fun that once he delayed at the table until before he knew it Gaara was sitting there with them. Being within arm's reach of the deadliest person outside of Orochimaru he'd yet met was something both frightfully terrifying and yet strangely normal after all that had happened. Really, it was exactly like he was just playing in a movie instead of feeling he was there for real. And, To him, it kind of was, as no matter what happened, the next day, all the players would be back to their starting positions, ready for another take. Plus, he got a good amount of valuable information out of the Sand siblings, who were, admittedly, amused by his attitude towards his teammate's death. So he might as well have some fun with it when he could. Although it was creepy when Gaara whispered across the table to him, "Are you here to validate my existence?" Then the blonde from Konoha found a new depth of bravery he hadn't suspected in himself and reached across the table, offering his hand to the red-haired boy. When the short psychopath didn't seem to know what to do with it, the Konoha genin offered him a grin as well. "Here, take my hand." Strangely, Gaara did so, placing his own in the proffered grasp. The demon container from Sand had no fear, as he knew next to nothing could hurt him. The sand shield that protected him was automatic, and even if it were not, he had his sand armor on. No, this clasping of hands was akin to a mouse asking a serpent to open wide. It gave every advantage to Gaara at no danger to him. Naruto clasped his hand around the other and smiled, saying, "Gaara, I don't need to die to validate your existence. I can do so as your friend, instead, and I acknowledge you. You are important to me. You are significant, and you can make the world a better place for everyone if you choose to do so." Gaara continued to stare at him for a very long time, before releasing his hand and not killing him. His siblings were shocked speechless, to say the least. Kankuro dropped a fork since he was so stunned he'd forgotten to hold on to it. Gaara didn't let Naruto leave his side for the rest of that reset. The next step, Naruto thought, was to find some way of doing that before Gaara killed Sasuke. If he could do that, then they could advance through the test and possibly he could discover something about getting out of this loop. Of course, that was made more difficult by Sasuke picking fights with Gaara and interrupting his plans to befriend him before anyone died. Naruto was so preoccupied by his thoughts of how to discuss things with Gaara before Sasuke died that he forgot the next time to pass on his warning about the test to Tenten, which meant that news did not spread, and Sasuke did not hear it. Naruto tried to tell him directly, only to not be believed. So, there they were, getting attacked by Orochimaru as usual when it just got too much to handle, coming as an interruption to all his other plans, as it had. "Oh, I give up. Just bite the bastard and be done with it. I'm tired of this." Naruto folded his arms, sat down, and pouted. "Kuku. Orochimaru laughed, before deciding, "Thank you, I believe I will. But aren't you in the least bit worried about my killing your team?" "Faye, why should I be?" Naruto started to pick his nose. "They're all useless. Look at little Miss Trembling over there. As near as I can recall, she's never hit anyone in anger except for me, and she does that for me trying to be nice to her. All she does in a fight is stand there and tremble, waiting for her hero to come make it all better, then afterwards she's all proud and boasting as if she'd won the whole thing herself." Sakura's jaw had dropped open and she stared at Naruto, too shocked to tremble anymore. Shocked, and a little bit afraid, Naruto's loyalty had been the one thing she could always count on in her life, and now he was giving her up to die. Suddenly she felt very small and vulnerable. "And that useless waste of flesh you're facing." Naruto pulled out his finger and wiped it on the branch. "He's as pathetic as they come. Every hour of every day since I met him he's spent feeling sorry for himself, and of course all of the girls our age are stupid enough to think that's cute. Everyone gives him anything he asks for and treats him as some kind of hero thanks to the family he was born in, but he's never done anything himself. As soon as he gets faced with anything the least bit hard he gives up, just like now when he was trying to give the scroll to you." "Oh, kuku. Interesting." The snake Sanin looked back to the boy who had been approaching him to surrender their team's scroll. The blonde genin snorted. "He's pathetic. If something isn't given to him for free by being a stupid Uchiha he doesn't want it, and then he has to go treat everyone else like garbage because he can, he's the Uchiha. Faye. Pathetic. Here we are in a fight for our lives, you're about to kill us all, and what does he do? He's playing sorry for himself, again. Heck, He's every bit as wimpy as his fangirl over there. But they're both so stupid they call me dead last, when it's always me who's pulling them out of these things. But when I do, they both instantly claim credit for themselves, as if it was their worthless behavior, standing there waiting for someone to rescue them, that somehow saved the day. Without me, they'd have lost every fight they've ever been in, they'd both be long dead by now, both them and their teacher, but they have to treat me as if my grades at the academy somehow, mysteriously, make it so my saving their scrawny, pathetic, useless lives in every fight since then doesn't matter. Go ahead, kill them both. They deserve to die. Sakura, who'd been shocked out of her paralyzing fear enough to listen, winced at every statement. Then she looked over to Sasuke, questions in her eyes. Had she been fooling herself all along? It didn't seem possible, but suddenly Sasuke didn't seem so invincible anymore. The Uchiha, however, was enraged that anyone would dare speak about him like that. It was a close call, but he elected to attack their enemy instead of Naruto, and when he launched his attack, he actually impressed the snake summoning freak. So the freak beat him up, bit him, and was gone, leaving them all alive for the first time in what felt like forever. Naruto was so stunned he nearly fell off the branch he'd been sitting on. Sakura was torn between mortified, scared and furious. Sasuke would have been raging mad, but was too busy being comatose and nearly dead. Sakura didn't attack Naruto for only 2 reasons. Dealing with her crush was a higher priority, and she was now scared of him. Naruto was still blinking. They were alive. Okay, quick, commit what happened to memory so he could do it again. Later that same reset, they were both kneeling over Sasuke's feverish and shaking body in a shallow cave made by tree roots when it happened. Nah. Sakura cleared her throat painfully. Naruto, do you think, maybe after we get out of here, you could take me out? He'd been a complete gentleman with Hinata, after all. That lunch date they'd been on together had been very cute. Surely it couldn't be too bad. Sakura's reasons were complicated, and she didn't fully understand them herself. Yet suddenly the fear of losing Naruto's support terrified her, and she'd begun to realize that would hurt her, that no one else had been so nice to her, and that she'd been driving him away. So she'd acted to do what she could to reel him back before it grew too late. The boy sighed, diverting his eyes to go look out over the rest of the forest. Sakura, I asked you out once a day, on average, for 6 years. That's 2,190 requests for a date, and each time you turned me down was worse than the last. Sorry, but I'm not interested. Oh, Sakura was devastated. He'd gotten away from her. She didn't know how, or when it had happened, but she had lost him. Her attempt to reel him back had come too late, and she'd missed all of the danger signs of his approaching separation. She felt shame as she realized it had been too late to keep him before she'd even thought to try. What had she done? Had she been so terrible? Except, well, maybe she had. Looking back on it, she couldn't recall the last time she'd said or done something nice for the blonde-haired boy. She hadn't wanted to encourage him, but suddenly she realized that he'd become her foundation. He'd been her one constant, a never-ending source of affection bearing her up no matter how life got her down, her ace in the hole against Ino, and something to cheer her up every time Sasuke turned her down, and now she had truly lost him. She couldn't put to words how much that hurt, or how scary it was to find herself cut free of that support, to suddenly find herself adrift in the world having to face all of the little hurts and Sasuke's rejections on her own. With a bite out of her heart she realized Naruto hadn't even been calling her Sakura-chan. It had always annoyed her before, but now, she missed it. Neither drew any attention to the fact that she began to cry behind him. It was an hour or more before she choked out, shyly. Naruto. Yeah, he did not turn to look at her. She spent a moment shivering over his coldness. Do you know so much I never expected. Do you know any special healing powers? I think Sasuke could really use some help just now. The blonde boy softly sighed. No, Sakura, I don't. Oh, she replied equally softly, her voice tinged with concern on behalf of their fallen comrade, and his plight. Inwardly, Naruto was thinking, just because I don't know any right now, doesn't mean I won't. Sakura is right. Healing my own wounds real fast isn't an excuse not to have any medical skills, because people around me can get injured. I've been careless, not studying those before. Well, it won't happen again. Before we come to this place again, I'll be a medic. Maybe even good enough I can save Sakura from choking on her blood if that happens again. Sakura was so wrapped up in her own misery she did not take as good a care of Sasuke as she might have, and he died, the cursed seal having overcome his frail vitality without that tiny extra edge. Love has a healing power all its own, completely apart from ninja skills, and the focus Sakura had once given to Sasuke had transferred some of her energies to him during those critical hours while the seal was turning his own chakra against itself. No matter how weak or powerful, a person is always equally matched against themselves, and the body paid the price of this battle the cursed seal initiated, usually ending in death. It may seem a small thing, but that was really the deciding factor in who lived and died upon receiving the cursed seal. Those who had someone to love and care for them lived, as even so tiny a boost was enough to tip the balance, while those who did not died. Orochimaru was ignorant of this himself, having no idea why one person lived and another died, despite decades of experiments. Healing techniques, all being chakra-based, got turned about the same way as a patient's own chakra supplies and were useless. Love, being made up of an entirely different energy, made up the difference in a way that got around the cursed seal's effect. However, with Sakura focused on her own misery and suffering, she did not have the total devotion to spare that had been bolstering his constitution that final, extra degree their first time through the forest. So, Sasuke died, and they reset. Naruto started getting severely frustrated. It did not take him many repeats to discover that it was not his performance that made the difference in whether or not they all survived that fight with Orochimaru. It was Sasuke. Naruto could commit everything he had to that fight, or nothing at all, and it wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference. The only thing that mattered was getting Sasuke worked up enough to go all out against the snake Sannin. If Sasuke impressed Orochimaru, then the missing ninja wouldn't kill any of them in order to let Sasuke continue on in the Chunin exams. Sasuke, like everyone, needed a three-man team in order to progress, and as near as Naruto could tell, the freaky snake guy wanted that for some reason. A bit of trial and error proved that Naruto didn't even have to get sealed during those fights. It happened if he went all out and forced the freak to deal with him, but he didn't have to do that, didn't have to do anything at all. It was all Sasuke. Life sucked sometimes. Hey, Kabuto, wait up. The named Genin and his team turned around to face the Uzumaki boy, who came running up to catch them, through the crowd leaving after the written test. Hey, the boy called out once he got closer. Kabuto, I need to be a medic ninja. Do you know how I should get started? You. Be a medic ninja? I'm afraid that's not really possible, Naruto. You'd need perfect chakra control, among other things. Kabuto laughed, but not with any real malice. Not about to be deterred, Naruto pressed on. What about that regeneration technique you do that I heard about? How do you do that? Still laughing, the silver-haired one shook his head. You know, if I felt there was any chance of you being able to use it, I'd never tell you. But just to show you how impossible it would be, let me show you how it works. Then you can try it yourself, and see how far away you are from doing this, and maybe pick a more reasonable specialty for your talents. Hey, Kabuto, wait up. The named Genin and his team turned around to face the Uzumaki boy, who came running up to catch them, through the crowd leaving after the written test. Hey, the boy called out once he got closer. Kabuto, your dad is the chief of Konoha's medical squad, isn't he? I was wondering if you could introduce me. I was hoping to pick up some basic stuff to do in an emergency. My team hasn't got a medic on it, and that lady who is to give us the next test scares me. I've heard of her reputation. Kabuto smiled. It's no problem, Naruto. Why don't I show you some myself? We've got time before we prepare for the next stage of the exam. Hey, Kabuto. Wait up. The boy called out once he got closer. Your dad is the chief of Konoha's medical squad, isn't he? I was wondering if you could introduce me. I was hoping for some tips and pointers. I know a little, but my team hasn't got a real medic on it, and that lady who is to give us the next test scares me. I've heard of her reputation. Kabuto smiled. It's no problem, Naruto. Why don't I show you some myself? We've got time before we prepare for the next stage of the exam. Hey, Kabuto, I've been reading some books on how to be a medic ninja, but I don't feel up to a real challenge yet, and I've heard some rumors about the next stage of our test tomorrow. I'm worried that I might not be able to do enough for my team if anyone gets injured. So, do you think you could point me towards some resources? Kabuto smiled. I could help you myself. Hey, Kabuto, I've been hearing rumors of the next stage of this test, and I've got to say I'm concerned. I'm the only medic my team has got, but I'm only half trained and my medical techniques stink. I was wondering if you knew someone who could help me. Kabuto straightened his glasses. That's very surprising, Naruto. I hadn't heard you had any medical experience at all. But I'll be glad to help you. There is a spare office in the hospital that is usually empty this time of day. We can use the charts and tools there. You really need perfect chakra control to be a good candidate for learning this technique, Kabuto told him. Yeah, I know, but the girl on our team has no interest in such things, and I've been elected. So how do you do the technique? Well, it would be easier if you had more knowledge of anatomy. Say, Kabuto, do you know where the Anbu have their anatomy classes? You know, the ones where they study nerves and pressure points for taking down targets. Kakashi told us about how they train Hunter Ninja to do that. Yes, of course I know. They do get most of their supplies from the hospital, after all. But why would you be interested in such things? Ah, there was this girl who did this thing on our last mission to induce false death in a target she wanted to capture. Our teacher wants us to look up those points so we can recognize them next time. Personally, I think he's just doing it to get out of teaching us anything himself. Well, Naruto, I don't really have time to teach you anything further. My team and I have to get ready for the test tomorrow. But if you still want to learn more, how about I introduce you to my father? He could at least loan you some books. He has an extensive library. So what now? How do I get to be a better medic ninja? I don't know that I'd call you a medic ninja, Naruto. Your healing techniques are clumsy and unpredictable. Frankly, I don't know how you got them to work at all, given your chakra control isn't half of what it ought to be to even learn them. I know I'd certainly never want to be your patient. However, you've got all of the book knowledge we ask of even our best shinobi healers. In fact, you know everything they do. I'm impressed. The only things you lack are chakra control and experience. But if you do go after the latter, you'd better do all of your practicing on Missing Ninja, because I don't want anyone from Konoha subject to your clumsy attempts. Kabuto laughed, but not with any real malice. Not about to be deterred, Naruto pressed on. What about that regeneration technique you told me about? How do you do that? Still laughing, the silver-haired one shook his head. You know, some secrets are best kept in families, Naruto. My father showed me that one, and I'd rather not be giving it out to anyone else. Hey, Kabuto, wait up. The named Genin and his team turned around to face the Uzumaki boy, who came running up to catch them, through the crowd leaving after the written test. Hey, the boy called out once he got closer. Kabuto, I need to be a medic ninja. Do you know how I should get started? You. Be a medic ninja? I'm afraid that's not really possible, Naruto. You'd need perfect chakra control, among other things. Kabuto laughed, but not with any real malice. Not about to be deterred, Naruto pressed on. What about that regeneration technique you do that I heard about? How do you do that? Still laughing, the silver-haired one shook his head. You know, if I felt there was any chance of you being able to use it, I'd never tell you. But just to show you how impossible it would be, let me show you how it works. Then you can try it yourself, and see how far away you are from doing this, and maybe pick a more reasonable specialty for your talents. Naruto grinned.